This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program, Living Legends Collection. There is no original date given for this interview. The interview was conducted by Mr. Frank Doyle. The interviewee is Mrs. S P Shelburne of Oklahoma City. This interview is being re-recorded on June the 4th, 1985, for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
Because all it is just a conversation, more or less, like we've been doing. And this morning, we're sitting on the 14th floor of Lakeview Tower, and for the Living Legend Library, talking with Mrs. Samuel Shelburne. SM, wasn't it?
No, Samuel Pinckney. Samuel P.
Samuel P.
Uh-huh.
And sort of just to find out reactions about Oklahoma City and some of the remembrances you have. And as we've been talking earlier, you came here as a bride, right?
1908.
1908.
I came here in 1907 to visit my grandparents. Their names was Cagle.
Cagle.
Uh-huh. Lucy and George Cagle, and they lived at Jet, Oklahoma. And I came here to visit them. And my husband was running the little lumber yard there. He saw me on the train and asked the conductor where I was going. And when the conductor said to Jet, he says, "That's all right." So the next day, he came over to see about the roof on the house. I never did think it needed any fixing. But he came over. Well, my grandmother was putting up fruit, and I was helping. So, of course, immediately when I saw some young man, I went into the bedroom and shut the door. He goes back over to the little store and said to him when I come in, he wanted to meet me. Well, I met him. The girl called him, told him I was in the store with my grandfather, and he came over, and we were introduced, and he asked me for a date. And I said, "I don't know about that. I'll have to ask my grandfather." Well, we had the date a few days later, and 2 weeks later, we went to Enid with a well-chaperoned group to a circus. And when we got off of the train, we went in a taxi. He wouldn't let me get in the car with anybody else. And we went up through town and to this jewelry store. And he had him stop a minute, and the man, he went in the store, and jewelry store, and he came out, and he had this ring. And he took it out of his pocket, picked my hand up. He said, "Will you wear this?" And 8 months later, we were married, and we lived together 58 and a half years. No, 48 and a half years. We just liked a year and a half being married 50 years. Long courtships, I guess, are all right. I was with him for 2 weeks. And then we went down in southern Oklahoma where my sister lived, and stayed there that winter. And he came back and forth to see me. And on May the 4th, 1908, we were married. So that started me as an Oklahoman.
Well, you're not originally from here then.
No. My grandfather on my father's side was a Methodist minister. My name was Presson, Presson. And grandfather came into Missouri from Tennessee in a covered wagon train. He was the minister. There was a young lawyer and a banker, and my grandfather being the minister, and then 2 or 3 other people, and they came in on that train,
Yes.
brought their families, and bought the land for 25 cents an acre rather than run for it like they did in the state of Oklahoma. Grandfather had a big family. My grandparents on my mother's side of the house came there shortly after that and settled at the little community of New Madrid, Missouri. The other grandfather settled at Charleston, Missouri, really out in the country on a farm. His children all bought land around him.
Yeah.
And that it was the history of the beginning of the Presson and Cagle family. My mother and father were married when she was 19. There was, as I told you, 8 of we children.
Yes.
Brother and sister died in infancy. The rest of us grew up to have children and grandchildren before the circle was broken. Our father died at 45. Our mother died about the same age.
Oh,
And
that's awfully young, wasn't it?
yes. But we girls have been a very close family. All have big families but me. And I adopted this, Mr. Shelburne and I adopted this boy, J.H. Shelburne, as he was known, or Shorty, when he was just a youngster. And it is his daughter and her baby that pretty well keep me busy these days. I don't have much time for anything.
How old is that grandchild?
The granddaughter is 26, and the baby is 10 months old.
Oh, boy.
Yesterday.
10 months yesterday?
Mm-hmm. Betty Ann Forseth, Betty Ann Shelburne she was, married Jerry Forseth.
Right.
And let's see, they've been married 6 years. How long since that would be? What year?
39.
39. No.
This is 65.
Well, Betty Ann's mother and my son were married in 39. And then the granddaughter married Jerry Forseth. Betty Ann Shelburne married Jerry Forseth 6 years ago. And now they have the baby that's 10 months old.
Well, they were married in 59.
Mm-hmm.
59.
And they just live 2 blocks away, so they're pretty good kids.
Well, that's convenient for you, isn't it? How old were you when you were married?
I was 17.
17.
And my husband was 19. My husband came to the Cherokee Strip with his father when he was 9 years old. And he had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. One sister passed away in infancy. The other sister is still living. She lives at Nash, Oklahoma. Mrs. L.A. Pitzer, or Grace Shelburne Pitzer. And one of the half-brothers is still living. He is Casey, or Kermit Shelburne. Lives at Dallas. They we lived in Waukeeta, where Daddy had, in the race, got the Cherokee Strip race, had gotten the town site. And we lived there a year and a half after our marriage. Then we went to Jet, where I originally met Mr. Shelburne.
Yes.
And then we lived there 7.5 years. We moved to Pine Creek, and from Pine Creek to Enid. And while in Enid, we had the Gentry Motor Company. And my husband got into the oil business in Enid. We sold out. The story of the oil business there was quite an interesting story. One of the barbershop type, he heard about this lease, and even though he didn't know anything about the oil business, went out and took the lease, and in 24 or 48 hours he had the stuff on the ground to drill the well, and it came in a big well. We at one time owned what is now the Champlin refinery. It was then the Fairmount refinery. And we sold out and came here with Dodge in 1918 because Mr. Gentry's son had come home from the Army. A bride in a new city has to have awful good friends in order to get along. Oklahoma City at that time, we bought a house at 438 West 20th. And Mr. Shelburne said he hated to buy that house because it was out so far that he was afraid the baby and I would get awfully lonesome. And that, as you know, is the second house off the corner of Walker.
Yes.
On 20th and right at Wilson School. So all of that was built up. We just had one neighbor on the corner and one on up the street at that time. They were building that block, and that was the G.A. Nichols edition. And of course called Winans edition later. But it was the G.A. Nichols is the man that she's a good one for you to talk to too.
Mrs. Nichols.
She
the same Nichols that
yes.
Developed Nichols Hills.
Yes, and she is just as cute and alert as she can be.
Right.
And her father was a minister and thus and so, and their story is one that should be kept for Oklahoma. They're great people and had much to do with his foresight built Nichols Hills, that's all. And some of the houses might not have been as good as my house was. But I can tell you right now, we owe a great lot to Mr. Nichols, I think.
Many people feel that way, yes.
And
wonderful their reputation.
They are a wonderful, wonderful family. There are many things in coming to a new city. We didn't want to leave Enid because we had made a way for ourselves there and were so crazy about it. But we came down here and moved in to the Huckins Hotel because that was quite a place.
Yes.
Until we could find out where we wanted to live. And the second week after we were here, the Rotarians asked Mr. Shelburne to come and be a member of the Rotary Club. He had been a member at Enid. So that helped us get started with a wonderful bunch of people who have been our friends all these years. Many of them still have a great influence. The McEldowneys, who young Jim McEldowney with Ansel Arbs were one of them. the mother was the first person to entertain for me when I came to Oklahoma City. And there were many, many other people than Nichols. Coyles, who did not live here at that time but lived in Guthrie, the Judge Bolts, the Taylors. Baxter Taylor was my husband's cousin, and that helped a lot. There were many, many people that you already know about that became our very close friends. John Lance Hill, who at that time was with Gum Brothers, and the Hills and the Gums, Dr. McHenry's, Lutz's, I was trying to think who else was on that board. Of the Sunbeam Home were very interested at that time in children. Had a little old frame building over on 21st Street, and it caught a fire one night. I had been on the board, I guess, along about 6 months or maybe a year. This was in 1919. And we decided to build a new building. Well, of course, we had to pound the streets to get the people interested in it. We didn't have many children, and they couldn't see why 6 or 8 children we ought to be so interested in. But we finally got the people to thinking about children being well taken care of and having plenty of milk and having as much of a home as you could make for them. So we built the Sunbeam Home building as it stands today. The two Buckley families, who are Mrs. Lutz's brothers, had much to do with it. The Harvey Evers got very much interested in it along about that time. And much of the history of the Sunbeam Home is a legend in Oklahoma City, because I think it was the first, in fact I know it was the first, to have a psychiatrist. It was the first one to begin to realize that children were not bad just to be bad, that bigger part of them needed help, and that if you could find out what they needed the most, why, that was one thing, but to find out what the parents needed was another. And to get people to come and talk to you about their problems and find out why they wanted to separate and why they wanted to break up homes and why they were not able to provide for their children was something that we began to realize we had to do. And of course, as you know, today it is the one children's organization that takes care of about anything that comes along that's wrong with the children, as well as the parents. We have just now completed a new office building on the ground of the Sunbeam Home. We train caseworkers over there for the university. We have secured land over in Capitol Hill now for a day nursery and we will soon build that building. We have a nursery over in Colored Town. We take care of all kinds of children. I was the first one to say we must take colored children. We had a woman working at the Sunbeam Home as superintendent with the name of McIntyre. And she called me one day frantically, or one evening, and she says, there's a colored baby that has to have some care. What shall we do? I said, you get the baby. The charter says children in need. It doesn't say anything about colored, what color they are. You go get the child. Well, of course, we were criticized terribly. Sure. But we got the child. And the next day we established a foster home for colored children. So that is where your foster home care started. And that is also where we broke down, to some extent, the racial problem. We have a nice nursery. We have colored people on our staff for every kind of work, practically, that we do with children. I don't know much I could add to that to tell you a little bit about the things that I have been interested. I never was anything, only a member of the board of these other organizations, or not of the board, I mean an interested person that was not on the board of these other charitable organizations. I always paid a Red Cross fee. I always paid a this or that come along. I don't mean I was not interested, but I always felt that if I did one thing, and I could do it as well as I knew how, that it would have to be something with children. So I've always been very much interested in the Sunbeam Home, and feel very humble in the fact that they thought I had done a pretty good job recently and made me a life member of that board. I married into the Christian church. My husband's family were members of that church, and he couldn't be anything else but a Campbellite. So I went with him to the Christian church. We've had lots of sorrow and lots of trouble in our church. Losing Bill Alexander as a minister was a terrible loss. And lots of our people went to other churches. Most of them stayed with their Christian denomination. But I have always felt if you put your hand to the plow, you couldn't turn back if it got in trouble, that you had to stay with it. So I am one of the ones that have been a member of the Christian church all these years. I knew nothing of business. I've had lots of fun trying to learn to manage a business. My husband was one of the originals of the Park Hotel, which is a small court, as you'd call it now, motor court. We were the first in the United States. Right after we opened ours, the Pennant people opened theirs. They closed up. Ours has never been closed a day since 1930, when we opened it. It started as a very small little project. Today it is a big project. It's a hard business to run. labor situations make it impossible to keep it on the even keel as you'd like to do.
Surely.
We have boasted that we had 9 members in our organization that had been there from 9 to 30 years. This last year, we have lost many of them because they had to go on retirement. And you can't be still there.
Real difficult, isn't it?
It's just difficult to do. After Mr. Shelburne's death, and I realized I had a big stake in the thing and must keep it, I bought the little bit of stock. We owned 92% of it at that time. On the advice of Mr. Bose, I bought the others out, and I have continued to run it. And as I said, it gets harder every day on the account of the labor situation. The oil business is a specialized business, and I have a man by the name of Dick Bertsinger that takes care of the Oklahoma City business. I have one by the name of John O. Farmer, at Russell, Kansas, that takes care of the Kansas business. Of course, now all of it has to come into this office, and and the final thing I have to say yes or no, which sometimes I don't know which to say. But I find that it's a challenge, it's fun, and I've tried to do like Mr. Shelburne did in this, that the days that it gets to the place where I don't know which way to do, I either get in a plane or in a car and I go somewhere. And when I get out a little ways, Daddy used to say, let's go someplace. We get out a little ways and he'd start a funny joke, and then he'd say, isn't it funny? You know, it looks different out here. So I do that too. And I think it helps. That's one reason I'm getting ready now to take this trip. We traveled much in our years together. We did all the United States and most of the countries surrounding it. We went around the world. We went to Europe in '39 and came home on the last ship when we got into the war. We were on the last one that came out. Had quite an experience. On that ship was Jim Farley and Mrs. Farley. We came to know quite well. Norma Shearer and her husband. Many celebrities. Elsie Maxwell. That we became good friends with. We got out on our way to Newfoundland because we were trying to get away from the troubles, and our ship was jackknifed, the back end of it. Water came rushing in a torrent. We wondered whether we could keep the door closed to our stateroom or not. And by the way, there were only 2 staterooms that were not taken away from the people. Ours was one, and Governor and Mrs. Trapp's was the other. And we got home with our car also. And on that ship, they had taken everything off of it that they could and made dormitories. And all these people were in dormitories made out of the lounges and the library and the different places. But I think the most unusual thing that happened was when we got to Cobh, Ireland, and the word came that we were already at war. That is, the countries over there, America had not gone into it. And I looked, Sam and my husband and Farley were standing on the platform watching the people and taking pictures and visiting. And people thought they looked so much alike, they'd just sign each other's names, you know. And I looked down, and the ship was painted with the American flag. And I looked up, and there was American flag stretched from one end of the ship to the other with searchlights on it. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine how I felt when I saw it.
What a thrill.
But we got home, and we were awful glad to get home, I can tell you.
Oh, I imagine.
It was
sort of a touchy crossing, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Well, then we didn't go back again until our granddaughter was old enough that we thought she should go. And we took her and went around the world. That time, of course, we flew. And we had many experiences on that trip. We started out with the red carpet. It was lots of fun. But you soon get awful tired of the red carpet. You get ready just to want to, let me be a bum.
Just get out and go on your own.
Yes, just let me be a bum. And we pretty well bummed our way through several of the countries, especially India, where we really needed help more than anywhere else. My husband's still a Rotarian. In every country he'd go into, that's where he'd head for. And there wasn't many places he didn't find a Rotary Club.
Right.
And it was very nice to have that, because he could get more of the view he wanted that way than any other way. But after my husband's death, and I kind of decided I'd have to be a old lady, rest a little while, and take another vacation. My husband's death, and I kind of decided I'd have to be a old lady, rest a little while, and take another vacation. Today I'm getting ready to go on this trip to the Holy Lands again, of which I've already been. This time on a guided tour, and then I will make Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. I will do Turkey and Africa. Not much of Africa, not as much as I should like to do, but I'll try to get just as much of it in as I can.
I bet you will.
I'm going to try to go next year again someplace else. Fred Jones has always think that Africa is they say Africa and New Zealand are the prettiest places that they've ever been. And they've been about everywhere, you know.
Wasn't your husband in business with Mr. Jones?
My husband was in business with him many, many years. They got into the oil business. We met the Fred Joneses when they were on their wedding trip. And we came home still liking each other. We made many trips together. Mr. Jones used to say in the early days when we'd go places, like we went to Canada to the Rotary Convention, and we drove back through the New England states. And Mr. Jones, when I say anything to him about it, he always says, well, all I did was read that book. And recently I gave him the books that they had in those days to tour by, you know. I thought he'd just as well have them. But we knew the Joneses through the years, and their children were our children. And today I feel very humble when I think about that we had the good fortune to have Fred and Eddie Jones, and they're wonderful, 2 children, and they enjoyed our sonning. And I think when we lost our son, they, like I was when they lost theirs, they were very much hurt. Mr. Jones is still one I always think is right waiting for me. If I need him, I know he's there. I try not to bother anybody. I've always kind of had a feeling that people had too much to do to be bothered unless it was, businessmen, And I've been most fortunate. Fred Jones, Chuck Bowes, Harvey Evers, Streeter Flynn, Judge Mills, Judge Bob during his lifetime, never turned me down if I needed him for anything. And that's saying a whole lot.
Yes, it is.
And of course we're very close social friends, all of us. But when I need them for business, they've always had plenty of time for me, which I think is a wonderful tribute to my husband. I don't think any of this, if I've accomplished anything, I couldn't have done it without. I'd have had Daddy, Mr. Shelburne, and these men. And Mr. Shelburne said one time when we went down to the Sunbeam Home, and I was having a dinner over there, and I needed so much done. I said, well, you're a good speaker. Why don't you do it? He says, it's your party. You do it. And I had to get up there before that crowd and sell the linoleum and the house to the people to get it furnished. And I never will forget him saying to me when we got through, well, I'll just take you along to make the speeches. And I said, what do you mean? Well, he said, if I'd have got up there and made the speech, why, I would have had it cut and dried, and you didn't do that. You just said what you had to say. And the people liked it, and you got what you wanted. So, anyway, he made me do it. And that's the way he did. About nearly
quite a guy.
About anything I did. I wish I was good at telling you stories, and I wish I could tell you some of his cute stories.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, this ought to be his life rather, and our lives rather than mine, because I don't think I could have done any of it without him. And I expect proof of the pudding is in the fact that we lived together as many years as we did. He probably felt we both needed each other.
It certainly must have been a compatible relationship.
And we had lots of fun, did lots of things. I wish that I could have had some of the earlier experiences, sod house days, sleeping on the counter in the store, and all of that to help my family get along. But my family didn't come to Oklahoma, you know. I had to come as a bride. And I am from a big family. The Shelburne family was a big family too. There were 19 Christian preachers in the family when I married into it.
In the Shelburne family?
In the Shelburne family.
That's amazing.
And I came as a Methodist, and my grandfather was a Methodist preacher, and there were a good many Methodists in our family that were ministers. We might have got into a lot of trouble, but we always had knew this, that if we did, those people would raise up in their graves and tell us to get on the right line, you know. There are many things in one's life as they go along that it makes you turn one way or the other. You have to get lost probably sometimes and think that there is no justice. As I felt when I lost my mother, I had an awful hard time getting myself back to a place where I could believe in a church or anything, because I couldn't understand why I had to lose my mother. And I'm quite sure that most people have times in their lives when they don't know which road to change. That's why you need all these things that we have today, or so many of them, that people can go and help. Today we have the open prayer chapel. You can go to my church down here at the Christian church, and we have a prayer chapel that's always open. I sit on the prayer chapel when we were establishing the one in Washington, D.C. I sat on that committee. It's never closed. It's always open. Well, of course, the Catholic people have done that many years. They had an open place to go, and they had help when they needed it, pretty much. But the Protestant people didn't have. But now, of course, religion is more a universal thing. And we're all getting closer together and realizing that the one thing we want is a good way of life. And we want everybody else to have a good way of life. And what I call a good way might not suit somebody else, you know. But I'm very proud of our church here. I still support the little school at Milligan, Tennessee, where Mr. Shelburne's family were ministers and teachers and heads of the school, the same way as I do my own back in southeast Missouri. I don't know much else I could tell you. That I think I've lived here long enough that most of this generation know me maybe too well. But anyhow, it's been...
well, as we talk, this city and the state is so young. It's still the first generation.
Yes,
isn't it?
That's right. And I am a part of that almost, because when you stop and think, this came into being in 7, that is, as a state.
That's right.
But of course it was opened several years before that, but then as a state, as statehood is concerned, it was in 1907 when it was made a state. And I was in Oklahoma at that time.
Well, to you, Mr. Shelburne, and many of the contemporaries, of your contemporaries, of your generation, helped to make this state, helped to make this city, because there wasn't anything here.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Of essence, a great deal of land, and but it all gets back to what you mentioned earlier, the people.
Yes. And it gets back to this, that here we realize more than ever before that we can't make more land. We've got to make it out of what we have. We have the foundation, but we've got to keep it and build it and make it a better piece of land, because we don't have any more. There's no more land for people to run for or to buy for 25 cents an acre. There's I don't know any frontiers that we could go to and do what we have done here. Of course, they're doing much in Alaska. They're doing much in many of these places. But Oklahoma pioneers had a struggle. They had an awful hard time getting the land to produce enough for them to live on. They couldn't fertilize it with their cattle because they must use chips to keep them warm in the winter and to cook by and all this, that, and the other. See, we had no timber to speak of. I used to say to my husband, "Oh, if I could just bring a tree home with me." And I think all of we people who came here, I was raised in a country where, oh my goodness, we have magnolia trees that are tremendous, you know.
Yeah, sure.
And I'd go back to my little town and I'd say, "Dr. Smith, oh, if I just could have one of those trees." And he'd say, "One of them is yours. Just pick you out any one you wanted." And of course they were as big as trees could grow. And I used to always say, "Well, this is my tree," and I'd come home every year to pull the blossoms off of it. But in Oklahoma, we had no trees. People who had a tree or a little bit of grass or a little bit of brush that they could let their cattle, the few they had, rest under, that was just about all we had in Oklahoma. When I came here a bride.
Where did you first live?
We first lived at Waukeeta.
I mean here.
In Oklahoma City. Well, we stayed at the Huckins Hotel about 8 months, and it was Lee Hotel then. We stayed on the 9th floor. We came to Oklahoma City in December of 1918. And that year we had driven our car back through Tennessee and Virginia and Missouri. It took us a week to get from Enid, Oklahoma to Charleston, Missouri, which now we drive in 3/4 of a day. And then we went on back from there through Illinois and Tennessee and Virginia and West Virginia back to my husband's, where his people lived, and then toured around through the South. It was equal to a trip around the world.
Yes, that's true.
It took us about 2 months before we could get back, and we finally had to ship in from past Christian, Mississippi. We had to ship our car in. It was just so rainy and muddy and bad, and we just came in on the train, and we came to Oklahoma City then. We sold our house at Enid, and we came here. We bought our house then in the spring of 19. We lived in that one house. We lived on 20th Street from 1919 until 6 months after Mr. Shelburne's death. I left 20th Street, which was...
That was out in the country then, wasn't it?
9 years ago, yes. When we came here, there was only our house. There were about 6 houses there. And Mr. Shelburne, as I told you, said, well, he had to buy that house that I liked on 20th Street because he said, "I'm afraid you and the baby will get lonesome. It's so far out." Wilson School was built. I believe they had already started it. That was one factor in our coming there. And how I got interested in the children's work was because my little boy had nobody to play with. And he got to playing with the Sunbeam Home children. Pretty soon he gave me everything we had. So I had to go over there and take him for him to play. But there wasn't much there. But it was lots of fun. Every new person that came in was interesting to us. In that block today lives the grandson of, or the son of Mage Cruz, whose uncle was governor of this state. Major Chris was an accountant, an insurance man, and so on. And the son and his children still live in the house that the Chris's bought at the time we bought ours. They live at 402 Northwest 20th. We were 438 West 20th. And we raised our children together, and thus and so. Chris's, both of them have gone, the older folks, but Marion still lives there with his family. And it's a sweet house. Drive by it someday, take a look at it.
I surely will.
And my house was across the street. After our son's death, he was killed in an automobile accident in Kansas. He was coming in from an oil well, and a truck pulled out of one of the yards, and he must have not seen them, and they must not have seen him, and the truck was turned over on him, and it killed him. Well, then, after that, I couldn't stay in that house, so we bought the house at 401 Northwest 20th, which was just across the street and up a little ways.
Yeah.
But I could always go down Hudson, and I never went by the other house then, you see. And the Creases and the people, the pioneers, the Hawks, and the Lee Crafts. Mr. Lee Craft was state treasurer here, came here from Durant. They bought in that block at the same time. The Frady's, who Joe still lives, but not Joe, but Cliff. But his brother lived next door to us. And the Callahans, who were wealthy Indians. Their grandson is wait a minute, I'll tell you his name. He's such a fine boy, Ed Moeller, young attorney. Well, his mother lived next door to me before ever she was married to his father. So I always claimed him too. Still got me a whole lot of boys.
You got a big family.
Yes, I couldn't get along without them. And then there was trying to think who helped make Oklahoma's history. The Callahans were wonderful, wonderful people. That's the Moeller boy's mother's family. And so many of those people who came in out of the state. The Pritchards lived across the street from us. That's the oil company. They came into that block at the time we did. The G.A. Nichols at that time lived on 21st Street. I believe they moved a year. There wasn't any house on 21st Street. I believe they moved there a year after I did. I think they built a house there. And then they went on up the street, Hudson. They were a pretty big family. Mrs. Nichols was a Johnson. And you know the Nichols girls, I expect. One of them is a Coyle and the other one a Cox. But you ought to have Mrs. Nichols tell you about Oklahoma as she knew it, because she knows an awful lot of Oklahoma history.
I suspect she does.
And she's a grand, and she's funny. She'll put a lot of humor in what she tells you, which is good. And I don't know. I came here to this building after my husband's death. I bought this property out here in Nichols Hills over on Queenstown, and it was all right as long as I had my granddaughter. And when she was married, why, I didn't want that house. So I came here, and I expect when they carry me out, why, it'll be from here, because I like it.
It's very pleasant indeed.
And I don't know what else I'd tell you about that would be interesting. If there's anything you think of you want to ask me, why, you do so.
If you don't mind talking about him, your husband rather intrigues me. He was quite an active man, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
And quite a personality.
Would you like to have bring back to me the little booklet that Walter Harrison made? He wanted to, by the way, they came here at the same time, and they were our neighbors.
Walter Harrison?
Uh-huh. Right
I
back.
met Mr. Harrison.
They were on 19th. Well, you know, he's been dead several years. He came to me right after Daddy went away, and he said, "Now, Gertrude, I want to write Sam's life story. Will you help me?" And, you know how you don't get around things. But one day he sent me a little book that he had pasted in the articles that my Sam had written to him for the paper.
Oh, yes.
He said he'd never do it again. He did it in 39 when we went over, and they were all published. And he says, I'll never help him again with it. That was for the Oklahoman. Then Harrison quit the Oklahoman, and he had this little paper out here. When we went over the last time, Sam didn't send anything to paper, and Fred Jones sent him a cablegram and says, "Now, Walter needs your help. You get something in here for him to put in the paper." Well, I have that little booklet and all the things that he wrote for the paper, and they're all silly. There's none of it that goes like anything that anybody else would write. He didn't tell him about the churches or about the museums or about things that we would do, only just the comical things, you know, the funny things that he would say. So if you'd like to read that, I'd be so happy for you to have it. And if in building this living history, as a part of this, it could be put on to this, I will get out of my files the tape and have it run and let you see. Walter was going to go over it and let you see if there's any of it that could be added to this that you would like to have.
Thank you. I think the college would appreciate that very much.
Because it would be something different to what anybody else ever done. Because Sam was not a man that ever conformed to anything. He was just Sam Shelburne. He just lived. He was droll. He never smiled. His eyes done his laughing. He was 6'2" tall. He was not a big man, not a fat man. And he was a man that had lots of fun. You wouldn't like him when you first knew him. But I don't believe he ever made a friend and lost one. He was primarily interested in young men or young women that would come to work for him. He'd come home. Do you want me to tell this?
Sure.
Is it on the tape?
Surely.
He'd come home in the office and he'd say, "Missy." That was my pet name. I never was called anything else. He'd say, "Missy, got a girl out here and she needs to go to an eye doctor. She can't ever get a job. She gets those eyes straightened out. So and so. Missy, so-and-so is wrong with the girl. Now, what will I do about it? You tell me, and I'll have some of the other girls in the office do it if you tell me what she needs to have done. What about her clothes? What about her facial appearances? What about this or that, you know? And many of the things would just be so comical the way he'd say it. And out we'd go. My son never left a great legend for people, but he left it with people that he helped. I don't suppose there's anybody in Oklahoma ever helped more young people to get an education or to get a start in the world than he did. And it was always somebody out here. He'd call the girl that worked for him the pig girl, because her people lived on a farm. And he'd say, now what do we do with the pig girl? So and so and so, you know. Well, the first thing you'd know, she'd have on the right kind of shoes, the right kind of clothes, and thus and so. And maybe she stayed with us, or maybe she went on to another job and he took somebody else. Or maybe somebody would hear about him and come over, and if he was sold on and thought they were telling the truth, why, he would always help him. He practically, John Metcalf has done well with his painting. But I bet you that my husband spent most of the money that went into Metcalf being a painter. Fred Jones would have made good anywhere. But you know, he and Mr. Shelburne got in the oil business in a rather interesting way. Mr. Jones had somebody with him that couldn't stay sober. And he had some oil interest with this man. And it got so every time my Sam would go to see about our business, he was seeing about Fred's too. So finally one day they decided to pool their stuff and go in the oil business together. So that's how they got together, you know. And as I said many times about Sam and Fred, they were as unlike each other as two people could be. Fred was kind of what you'd call, well, he was an automobile man.
Yeah, he's a salesman.
Yeah. And my Sam was one of these slow, dry people. And Sam never made up his mind in a hurry about anything. I don't know how he made up his mind to marry me as quickly as he did. But anyway, he was lots of fun. Never smiled when he told a story. Tell it with a sour face. And I think perhaps that was one reason why that he and Mr. Vose and Mr. Jones and all of the gang got along so well, was because they were so
different.
So different. One little incident. I remember when we were going abroad the first time, Governor and Mrs. Trapp were going with us. My husband saying to me, well, he wanted me to have a white rabbit coat. I said, white rabbit coat? What do you mean? Well, so-and-so. I said, well, I don't need a white coat. I've got one. He said, well, he wanted me to have a white ermine coat, is what he meant. And going on the ship, and he said, I want you to have. I said, well, Daddy, I don't need one. He says, well, we're going to be. I said, well, Daddy, I don't need one. He says, well, we're going to be. I said, well, Daddy, I don't need one. He says, well, we're going to be. I said, well, Daddy, I don't need one. He says, well, we're going to be. I said, well, Daddy, I don't need one. He says, well, we're going to be. I said, well, Daddy, I don't need one. He says, well, we're going to be. I said, well, Daddy, I don't need one. He says, well, we're going to be. I said, well,